You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The idea of American exceptionalism centers on the belief that the United States stands out from other nations in terms of its values, political structure, and history. Those who support this notion argue that America's distinctiveness isn't just about being different. It's about having a unique and positive role in the world. This concept traces back to the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, who, after visiting the U.S. in 1831, was the first to call the country exceptional because of its stark contrast to places like Great Britain and his home France. Interestingly, the term American exceptionalism itself was first used not in praise but in heated debates among American communists in the late 1920s. Seymour Martin Lipset, an influential political scientist and sociologist, pointed out that America's roots in the Revolutionary War mark its start as a nation like no other, a first new nation, born with a mission and an ideology of its own, including freedom, equality, individual rights, democracy, and a free market economy. These foundations, which sometimes go by the name of Americanism or American exceptionalism, highlight why the U.S. is often seen as an outlier on the global stage. However, this idea doesn't come without its critics. Some argue that claiming American exceptionalism implies the U.S. is superior to other countries, promoting a notion of cultural dominance or a unique responsibility to change the world. The idea that the United States stands out as a unique nation has deep roots, with some tracing this belief back to the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville or even the Founding Fathers during the American Revolution. An interesting mention from the Times of London in August 1861 references Americans' sense of exceptionalism amidst the Civil War, but it was American communists in the late 1920s who first used the term American exceptionalism. The Oxford English Dictionary points out its first recorded use in the Daily Worker on January 29, 1929, regarding the Communist International's strategies in America. This term caught the attention of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who rebuked the idea during a heated conversation with J. Lovestone of the Communist Party USA, criticizing the notion that the U.S. was above Marxist historical laws due to its natural wealth, industrial strength, and less defined class lines. Despite its origins, the term became widely used by intellectuals and resurfaced in U.S. newspapers in the 1980s to underscore the nation's distinct culture and politics. In 1989, Scottish political scientist Richard Rose observed that most American historians agree with the idea of exceptionalism, attributing the U.S.'s uniqueness to its history, size, geography, political framework, and culture. He noted that explanations for the expansion of government in Europe might not align with the American experience and vice versa. However, post-nationalist scholars contest this view, arguing the U.S. hasn't significantly deviated from European history and still grapples with class and race issues, imperialism, and a propensity for war. The debate over American exceptionalism's validity and relevance spans across disciplines, drawing in academics, politicians, and media figures. Scholars Roberts and de Quercy question why the narrative of American exceptionalism, with its focus on the nation's rich natural resources, revolutionary start, and Protestant religious ethos, has remained influential in shaping both popular culture and foreign policy. Some historians acknowledge the uniqueness of the American experience, but steer clear of the American exceptionalism label to avoid being dragged into semantic debates. Harvard's Bernard Bailyn, an expert on colonial America, emphasized the distinctive features of American civilization without frequently using the term, highlighting the peculiar American approach to education and the Revolution's unique character. The concept of American exceptionalism even became a point of discussion in the 2008 presidential race, with then-candidate John McCain critiquing Barack Obama for purportedly questioning the idea. The idea that America is unique, first named and perhaps introduced by the French author Alexis de Tocqueville in his works from 1835 and 1840 titled Democracy in America, highlights a special situation Americans find themselves in. He observed that factors like America's Puritan roots, its focus on commerce, and even its geography, along with its close ties to Europe, allow Americans to somewhat ignore the arts and sciences without falling into ignorance. Tocqueville noted that many unique reasons, of which he detailed a few key ones, have shaped Americans to concentrate on practical matters above all else, except for occasional religious reflections. Following Tocqueville, numerous international commentators, including well-known figures like Karl Marx and H.G. Wells have acknowledged and sometimes praised the idea of American exceptionalism. It grew into a popular concept, particularly in educational materials. For instance, the McGuffey Readers, textbooks that reached 120 million copies sold from the 1840s through the end of the 19th century, celebrated the notion of America as a land of destiny and divine purpose. These readers presented America as a nation with a significant role in spreading freedom and democracy worldwide, as argued by Skrobeck in 2009. Back in June 1927, J. Lovestone, who was about to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party USA, shared some thoughts on what made America's economy and society unique. He pointed out the growing strength of American capitalism and the nation's tremendous reserve power, suggesting these factors were keeping a communist revolution at bay in the U.S. However, by mid-1929, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wasn't convinced by Lovestone's views on America's resistance to revolution. He criticized Lovestone's perspective, dismissing it as the heresy of American exceptionalism. This critique by Stalin seems to have been sparked by an article published earlier that year in the Daily Worker. When the Great Depression hit the United States, it seemed to prove Stalin right, indicating that American capitalism wasn't immune to the broader principles of Marxism after all. By June 1930, at the Communist Party USA's National Convention in New York, a strong statement was made. The storm of the economic crisis in the United States blew down the house of cards of American exceptionalism and the whole system of opportunistic theories and illusions that had been built upon American capitalist prosperity. This statement vividly expressed the view that the economic turmoil had shattered the myth of American economic invulnerability. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the LDS Church or Mormons, holds a special view of the Americas, including the United States, as a land set apart, inhabited by a chosen group of people, including Native Americans who are believed to be partly descended from the Lamanites of the Book of Mormon. This belief ties the destiny of the United States to that of the biblical Promised Land as outlined in the Book of Mormon. This faith also sees the U.S. Constitution as being divinely inspired. Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS Church, promoted the idea that the millennial New Jerusalem would be established in America, as mentioned in the 10th Article of Faith. Furthermore, he shared a revelation from God stating that no one should be enslaved by another, highlighting that the Constitution was established by wise men under divine guidance for this purpose, and the land was freed through sacrifice. Doctrine and Covenants 101:79-80. Despite official disapproval from the LDS Church, there are fundamentalist Mormons who follow the White Horse Prophecy. This belief predicts that Mormons will play a crucial role in saving the Constitution when it is in jeopardy. Regarding America's perceived uniqueness, historian Dorothy Ross outlines three notable perspectives. Firstly, some Protestants viewed America's progress as a sign of the impending return of Jesus Christ and the dawn of the Christian millennium. Secondly, 19th century historians saw American freedom as a continuation of the development of liberty that began in Anglo-Saxon England. Lastly, some American authors celebrated the concept of millennial newness in America. Henry Nash Smith emphasized the idea of the American frontier as virgin land, offering a fresh start away from the decay experienced by older republics. Back in April 2009, during a press conference in Strasbourg, President Barack Obama was asked a question that led him to talk about what is often called American exceptionalism. In his response, Obama said he did believe America was exceptional, just like the British might feel about their country or the Greeks about theirs. He added that this belief in America's special role did not stop him from wanting to work with other nations to solve global issues together, because no country can tackle these problems alone. Mitt Romney, a political figure, criticized Obama, claiming this view showed Obama did not really think America was exceptional. Another critic, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, argued that Obama's perspective was vastly different from any past U.S. president, suggesting Obama was more of a globalist than a true believer in American exceptionalism. Huckabee felt denying this exceptionalism was like denying the very essence of America. Moving to 2013, during a speech about the situation in Syria, Obama expressed that America's willingness to act against atrocities, such as preventing the gassing of children, showcased what made America exceptional. The very next day, Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times, cautioning against the dangers of seeing oneself as exceptional, pointing out that such a viewpoint could be perilous, and reminding readers that we are all created equal in God's eyes. Donald Trump, who would later become president, praised Putin's article, calling it a masterpiece. Trump questioned the idea of American exceptionalism from the perspective of other countries, suggesting it could be seen as insulting. Some left-leaning commentators in the U.S., like Sheryl Schweninger from the New America Foundation, have found common ground with Trump's critique, arguing for an end to what they see as America's globalist policies. Although Trump's America First approach advocates for American nationalism and acting independently, it also suggests a less interventionist stance internationally. Since 2012, the Republican Party has officially embraced the concept of American exceptionalism, framing it as America's unique moral leadership role in the world. This was further highlighted in their 2016 party platform, which called for the U.S. to assert its leadership globally once more. Former Vice President Dick Cheney also contributed to this discussion with his 2015 book, Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America, reinforcing the notion that America has a significant role to play on the world stage. Scholars have delved into the reasons behind the idea of American exceptionalism, with many referencing the work of Louis Hartz, a political scientist from Harvard. In his 1955 book, The Liberal Tradition in America, Hartz suggested that America's political scene didn't develop the left-wing or socialist and right-wing or aristocratic tendencies seen in Europe because the early U.S. didn't have feudal traditions like established churches, large landed estates, or a hereditary nobility. This led American politics to center around a form of Lockean liberalism. Hartz pointed out that even though some European feudal practices like primogeniture came over to America, their disappearance around the American Revolution only solidified America's liberal stance. Following Hartz, the liberal consensus approach, showcased by scholars like David Potter, Daniel Boorstin, and Richard Hofstadter, argues that American political disputes historically stayed within the bounds of liberalism, particularly concerning private property, individual rights, and representative government. This perspective suggests that the U.S. national government ended up being much less centralized than those in Europe. However, not all scholars agree with this view. Sheldon Wolin believes the American Revolution was more about pushing back against British government centralization rather than escaping feudal traditions. Karen Oren has noted that feudal-like employment laws remained in the U.S. into the 1930s. James T. Kloppenberg criticized Hartz for oversimplifying U.S. history by calling it a uniform liberal consensus. Conversely, Catherine A. Holland thinks some critics have misinterpreted Hartz, arguing he did recognize divisions in American politics, though he saw them as variations within liberalism rather than outside of it. American exceptionalism, or the idea that the United States is distinctively unique, partly comes from its Puritan foundations. Back in the day, many Puritans who slightly differed from the strict beliefs of Calvinism thought of themselves as chosen by God to be a prime example for other nations. They envisioned their society as a city upon a hill, a concept famously articulated by Puritan leader John Winthrop, meaning New England's Puritan community was meant to be a model for the entire world. This idea has stayed relevant, often cited by those who believe in America's special role. The connection between these Puritan values and American capitalism was explored by Max Weber, a key figure in this area. According to Eric Louis Ullman from Northwestern University, the influence of Puritan values eventually spread throughout American society, shaping its identity. Kevin M. Schultz points out that these values not only persisted, but also played a role in helping America maintain what he calls its Protestant promise, impacting not just Protestants, but also Catholics and Jews, shaping the nation's moral and cultural landscape. The American Revolution was sparked by a set of ideas rooted in republicanism, a tradition that was not very popular in Britain at the time. Historian Gordon S. Wood has pointed out that key American values, such as liberty, equality, and constitutionalism, as well as the notion that Americans are chosen for a special role in leading the world towards democracy, all stem from this period. Despite the concept facing criticism today, it has its staunch defenders, including John Butler. Thomas Paine's influential work, Common Sense, really drove home the idea that America was not just an offshoot of Europe, but a new, vast land of opportunity. that had essentially outgrown its British roots. This thinking laid the groundwork for the idea of American exceptionalism, anchored in the belief that power should rest with the people rather than a king or noble class. Religious freedom also played a crucial role in setting the American Revolution apart. At a time when most major nations were enforcing state religions, leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were pioneering a form of constitutional republicanism that separated church from state. Historian Thomas Kidd highlights a significant shift in thinking during the Revolution, as Americans began to believe that God had a special purpose for their nation. This led to a merging of Christian and Republican ideologies, convincing even traditionalists to fully embrace the ideals of Republican virtue. Tucker and Hendrickson, in their 1992 work, highlight Thomas Jefferson's vision for America as a pioneer in a new kind of diplomacy. He saw the country as a leader grounded in the freedom and virtue of its people, aiming to protect the natural and universal rights everyone should enjoy, without resorting to war. Jefferson wanted to move away from the old European ways where state reasons could excuse any action, often putting the desires of rulers above the needs of their citizens. He dreamed of America as an empire of liberty, a shining example of democracy and republicanism for the entire world. Jefferson regarded his country as a guiding light for liberty and self-government, a role he emphasized as he left the presidency in 1809. He proudly spoke of America as the solitary champion of human rights, tasked with keeping the sacred flame of freedom alive, hoping its ideals would inspire other parts of the world ready for change. Marilyn B. Young has made the case that after the Cold War concluded in 1991, neoconservative thinkers and policymakers latched onto the concept of an American empire. They viewed it as the country's duty to spread freedom and democracy, especially to less wealthy nations. According to Young, the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, caused a major shift in U.S. foreign policy under President George W. Bush. The administration became focused on maintaining America as the top military and economic power in the world, aligning with the newfound idea of an American empire. Young points out that the Iraq War, which lasted from 2003 to 2011, was a prime example of this approach, showcasing American exceptionalism. In 2012, conservative historians Larry Schweikart and Dave Doherty presented their view on American exceptionalism, breaking it down into 4 key elements: the system of common law, the role of virtue and morality rooted in Protestant Christianity, the commitment to free market capitalism, and the respect for private property rights. Dick Cheney, the former U.S. Vice President, in his 2015 book, Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America, strongly advocates for the concept of American exceptionalism. He echoes Abraham Lincoln's words, describing America as the last best hope of earth. Cheney argues that America's role isn't just another country on the global stage, but is crucial for the advancement and protection of freedom worldwide. He stresses that future leaders must remember and champion the unique and important role of the U.S., following in the footsteps of leaders like Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Reagan, who reminded Americans of their exceptional status. Supporters of the idea that America is unique or American exceptionalism make the case that the United States stands out because it was built on ideals like freedom and equality, instead of a shared background, ethnicity, or a powerful elite. Abraham Lincoln summed this up beautifully in his Gettysburg Address, saying America is all about the belief that all men are created equal, and emphasizing that the country's mission is to ensure a government of the people, by the people, for the people, endures. Historian T. Harry Williams dives deeper, explaining Lincoln's vision of America as not just a place where freedom is cherished, but as a beacon of democracy with a responsibility to inspire freedom worldwide, simply by setting an example. From the start, American political strategies have featured a mix of federalism, which is the balance of power between state and national governments, and checks and balances among the branches of government. These systems are designed to keep any one group or government branch from grabbing too much power. Advocates for American exceptionalism argue that this setup helps to avoid what is called a tyranny of the majority, keeps democracy alive, and allows locals to live under laws that match their values, even though it means laws can vary quite a bit from place to place. However, critics argue that it just swaps federal dominance for state dominance over local matters. Generally, the system does seem to allow for local preferences, but stops the kind of national dominance seen in countries with more centralized government systems. Historian Eric Foner discusses the unique aspect of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which grants anyone born in the U.S. citizenship. He notes this as a distinctive feature of American exceptionalism, pointing out that this kind of citizenship policy sets the U.S. and Canada apart from European nations, highlighting another angle on what makes America different. Yale Law School's Dean Harold Hongju Ko highlights a vital aspect that sets the United States apart in global affairs, especially in terms of international relations, law, and human rights advocacy, its unparalleled international leadership and activism. He points out that the United States stands out as a superpower, unique in its ability, and sometimes its willingness, to invest substantial resources and endure significant sacrifices to uphold an international order based on the principles of international law, democracy, and human rights. He emphasizes that the United States has a history of inspiring other nations to follow its lead in human rights efforts, citing examples from Nuremberg to Kosovo. Peggy Noonan, a respected American political commentator, once remarked in the Wall Street Journal that America's attempts to be a force for good around the world are not what make it exceptional. Instead, it is America's inherent exceptionality that drives its efforts to do good. Furthermore, former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, alongside his daughter Liz Cheney, a former State Department official, explored the theme of American global leadership in their 2015 book, Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America. In it, they discussed the critical role of the United States in international politics and its necessity for a stable and just global order. Supporters of the idea that America is unique often point to the way the frontier shaped the so-called American spirit. They follow the thinking of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, suggesting that the frontier encouraged people to be individualistic as they embraced democracy and equality. They moved away from old European traditions like royalty, standing armies, wealthy churches, and a class of aristocrats who owned most of the land. However, it's important to note that while America's experience with the frontier was influential, it wasn't entirely one of a kind. Other countries like South Africa, Russia, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, and Australia also had frontiers. But these places didn't see their frontiers shape their national character in quite the same way, mostly because they were tightly controlled by strong central governments. Unlike in America, there wasn't the same access to free land, or the ability for settlers to have a say in their local and regional governments. As a result, their frontiers didn't mold their national identities in the same way. To give you an idea of how varied these experiences were, let's look at a couple of examples. In South Africa, the Dutch settlers known as Boers were eventually defeated by the British. Over in Australia, the culture valued mateship and cooperation over the individualism that's seen as a hallmark of the American spirit. For much of its history, particularly from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, the United States has been celebrated as a place where anyone can find success and upward mobility, no matter their background. This belief in the land of opportunity highlighted three main areas. First, in terms of jobs, children were not limited to following in their parents' footsteps. They could choose any career path they wanted. Second, moving around the country was common and easy, with people often picking up to venture across vast distances without any restrictions. And third, unlike many places where your family's status or wealth defined you, in America the idea has always been that hard work can lift anyone into a higher social or economic position. This belief in the ability to achieve a better life through hard work is what is often referred to as living the American dream. In this way, where you came from did not necessarily dictate where you could go, especially in terms of achieving high social or political status, a stark contrast to other countries where such roles were typically reserved for those born into them. Despite this, data suggests social mobility in the U.S., particularly when looking at income changes, is lower than in some European Union countries. For instance, American men born into the lowest income levels are more likely to remain there compared to their counterparts in Nordic countries or the United Kingdom. Harvard economist N. Gregory Mankiw points out that this is not so much about a rigid class system as it is about the wider gap between income levels in America. Basically, it is harder to climb a taller ladder. When it comes to public welfare, Richard Rose pondered in 1989 whether the U.S. was beginning to resemble other welfare states with mixed economies, or if it remained an outlier. He concluded that the U.S. stands apart from other advanced industrial nations in terms of total public spending, the main priorities of its programs, and the value of the public benefits provided. Historian Michael Kamen tells us that back in the 1970s, right after the Vietnam War, people started to really question certain ideas. Kamen says that intellectuals felt that the notion of the American atom, this idea of pure innocence, had been replaced by a more tarnished, helpless image, kind of like a constrained Gulliver. Around the same time, a new approach to history, called the New Social History, began applying statistical methods to look at population samples. The findings suggested that in areas like social mobility, America wasn't all that different from Europe. By the 1980s, historians focused on labor began to point out that the absence of a significant workers' party in the U.S. suggested that conditions for American workers weren't as exceptional as some like to think. Towards the end of the 1980s, some academics even started criticizing what they saw as an over-the-top sense of national pride, or chauvinism, associated with the idea of American exceptionalism. Also, in the mid-1980s, there was a lot of debate among colonial historians about whether the American experience was truly unique, especially when compared to British history. Despite these debates, some scholars like Willents and Foner insisted on certain unique aspects of American life, highlighting unique forms of class conflict and the distinct nature of American trade unionism. The concept of American exceptionalism, particularly its notion of superiority, has not been without its critics. Some argue that it comes with a moral flaw and is marked by a habit of holding double standards. Canadian commentator Michael Ignatieff, in his 2005 book American Exceptionalism and Human Rights, takes a critical look at this idea. He breaks down the critique into three categories: exemptionalism, where the U.S. supports international treaties but insists on being exempt from them; double standards, which involves calling out other countries for not following international human rights recommendations while ignoring what those organizations say about the U.S., and legal isolationism, which refers to how U.S. judges often pay no mind to the legal practices in other countries. During the time George W. Bush was president, from 2001 to 2009, the idea of American exceptionalism started to shift from its original meaning. People both supporting and opposing the concept began to use it to suggest that the U.S. sees itself as above or an exception to international law, rather than emphasizing America's unique qualities. This shift towards focusing on the U.S.'s supposed immunity to the laws that govern other countries has made the topic more complex and confusing, moving away from earlier interpretations. However, it's important to note that quite a few people who believe in the classic idea of American exceptionalism, which views America as uniquely different and with a special role in world history, also firmly believe that the U.S. must follow international law just like any other country. Recent studies have shown that while there's a sense of American exceptionalism among the U.S. public, there's little support for the idea that the U.S. should act unilaterally, ignoring international agreements and laws. Critics like Marilyn Young and Howard Zinn have pointed out the darker sides of American history, like slavery, civil rights issues, and problems with social welfare, arguing these flaws make it hard to see America as a shining example of virtue. Howard Zinn specifically doubts the idea that American exceptionalism comes from a divine place, especially considering the treatment of Native Americans, saying it is far from benevolent. Donald E. Pease, in his 2009 book The New American Exceptionalism, describes American exceptionalism as nothing more than a state fantasy and a myth. He emphasizes that no matter how hard these myths try to cover up the country's flaws, incidents like the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuse scandal and the mishandling of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina reveal the cracks in this so-called exceptionalism. Reinhold Niebuhr, a theologian from the United States, warned that assuming America always acts in the right could lead to moral decay. Even though Niebuhr supported America's stance during the Cold War, he introduced Christian realism, a concept that encourages a responsible approach to interfering in other nations' affairs grounded in a liberal viewpoint. Historian John Meacham discusses how leaders have made a mix of moral decisions, showing that people can evolve from bad to good choices or vice versa, and sometimes they correct mistakes made by those before them. This adds layers to the conversation about American exceptionalism and the moral direction of its leaders. U.S. historians like Thomas Bender are challenging the resurgence of American exceptionalism, a viewpoint they believe stems from the Cold War era. Bender and others argue that this idea is outdated and misguided. Gary W. Reichert and Ted Dixon discuss the United States' reliance on international relationships for everything from goods to cultural values and people, suggesting that America's development isn't as self-contained as some might think. Roger Cohen poses an interesting question. If America has to work together with other countries to tackle big issues like terrorism, nuclear threats, and fluctuating gas prices, can it truly consider itself exceptional? Harold Coe points out several aspects of American exceptionalism, including what he sees as a flying buttress mentality and, more critically, a tendency towards double standards. He believes this double standard is the most harmful aspect of American exceptionalism, undermining its validity. Godfrey Hodgson goes further to label the U.S. national narrative as not just flawed, but dangerous. Samantha Power observes that America is not living up to its image as a beacon of hope or as effective global interveners. She believes it will take a considerable amount of time, perhaps a generation, to reestablish a more credible form of American exceptionalism. Despite the United States being known for its democratic values, political stability, and a history largely free from war on its own territory, especially when compared with many European nations, it has experienced significant challenges. Among the most critical of these was the American Civil War. Furthermore, even after ending slavery, the U.S. federal government did not fully honor the Equal Protection Clause for African Americans during the Jim Crow era, nor for women's right to vote until the introduction of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Additionally, although it is Congress's job under the Guarantee Clause to ensure all states have a Republican form of government, there have been instances where white supremacist takeovers of local governments were overlooked, notably during the election riot of 1874 and the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, though other attempts at such coups were thwarted. Internationally, the U.S. has utilized its military, diplomatic corps, intelligence services, and foreign assistance to defend democracy across the globe, supporting allies in World War II, democracies during the Cold War, and Israel. Its efforts have even extended to forcibly introducing democracy in certain instances, as seen in territories defeated in World War I, World War II, and the 2003 Iraq War. However, the U.S. has also been involved in the removal of democratically elected governments, often driven by economic interests or anti-communist sentiments. This includes interventions such as the 1913 Mexican coup, which went against presidential orders as detailed in the context of the U.S. involvement in the Mexican Revolution, the coup that removed Arnulfo Arias in 1941 to secure the Panama Canal, the 1953 Iranian coup, the 1954 Guatemalan coup, the 1960 removal of Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the 1964 Brazilian coup. In a notable shift, the U.S. reversed its previous stance of supporting a military junta in Haiti, actively working to restore democracy with Operation Uphold Democracy in 1994-95. In 1898, Pope Leo XIII made a strong statement against what he saw as the erroneous belief of Americanism through his letter Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. He took issue with the idea of American exceptionalism, especially when it came to church matters, pointing out that it clashed with the Church's warnings against modern trends that strayed from traditional teachings. Back in those days, many Catholic leaders in the U.S. believed that American society was unique compared to other Christian countries. They felt that the Church's teachings needed to expand to fully grasp the American experience. This experience was marked by a higher value on individual freedom, acceptance of different religions, and a clear distinction between religious and government institutions. Herbert London introduced the term preemptive declinism, suggesting the idea that the United States does not stand out as a unique nation deserving a special role in global affairs, just like any other country does not. This perspective, according to London, is shared by Paul Krugman, among others. Krugman has expressed in the New York Times his belief that America's time as the top nation in the world was bound to end someday, but he thought its decline would be a dramatic and solemn event. Real Clear Politics points out that the narrative about America's diminishing power is not new in English-speaking media circles. For instance, Flora Lewis remarked in 1988 that the reality of U.S. decline stems from its inability to control everything or foot all the bills anymore. By 1990, Anthony Lewis highlighted that both Europeans and Asians were beginning to see proof of the U.S. losing its edge, citing America's reliance on foreign energy and significant military vulnerabilities. Tom Wicker expressed concerns over the challenges the U.S. faces in keeping its superpower status, labeling it as an almost impossible task. Patrick Buchanan, reflecting on the country's situation in 2004, talked about the fall of what was once the greatest industrial republic. In 2007, Matthew Paris reminisced about the era of the Kennedy presidency as a time when the U.S. led with strong moral arguments instead of force, stating that the U.S. is now overstretched. From Shanghai, Howard French of the International Herald Tribune voiced concerns about the fading moral influence of the U.S. on a rising China. Fareed Zakaria, in his book The Post-American World, paints a picture of a world where it is not that America is in decline, but rather it is about other nations stepping up. He emphasizes that the shift is not about the U.S. losing ground, as much as it is about the rest of the world advancing. In December 2009, historian Peter Baldwin released a book making a compelling argument. He suggested that the familiar attempt to draw a sharp line between the American way of life and the European social model might not be as clear-cut as we often believe. According to Baldwin, America and Europe share a lot of similarities across various social and economic measures. He pointed out, however, that the existence of a black underclass in the U.S. is a key factor behind the significant differences that do exist, especially in areas like homicide rates and child poverty. Historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto has brought up an interesting point about how people generally see themselves as exceptional. He's observed that when you really get into the details, the similarities between supposedly different groups are often more pronounced than their differences. He talked about how features like dynamic wealth creation, democracy, the accessibility of opportunities, the emphasis on civil liberty, and a tradition of tolerance are common in many modern societies. But Fernandez Armesto also mentioned what he sees as negatives, such as a materialistic economy, excessive privileges for the wealthy, and a sort of selective restriction of freedom. What makes America stand out, he suggests, is the sheer intensity with which all these characteristics, both good and bad, present themselves. Critics have taken issue with the concept of American exceptionalism, pointing out that it has fueled much of the territorial expansion seen in the 18th and 19th centuries across the Americas. Deborah Madsen has noted that the impact of this idea has evolved over time, starting with the taking of Native American lands and moving on to the era of manifest destiny. This period included the Mexican-American War and various land purchases throughout the 19th century. Furthermore, Madsen highlights the critique by Frederick Douglass, a notable black abolitionist active before and during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Douglass had contended that the notion of American exceptionalism was ludicrous, especially with the ongoing reality of slavery at that time. Additionally, critics argue that there's a shared belief among the political leadership in the U.S. in using the country's power to bring democracy to nations ruled by oppressive governments. This belief has been illustrated in modern times by actions such as the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.